They poured whiskey over his head like it was cheaper than water, laughing as it ran down Ethan Cole's face and soaked into the dust at his boots. And in that moment, the whole town agreed on one thing. He was finished. The sun sat high over the crooked saloon sign, heat pressing down like a hand that never let go, the smell of stale liquor and horse sweat hanging thick in the air as men leaned on the railing. Women watched from shaded windows, and no one stepped forward, not one, except her. She stood just beyond the circle, still as a fence post in open land, dark hair catching the light, eyes steady and unafraid. Apache, they whispered, like it explained everything and nothing at all. Ethan didn't look up at first, didn't have the strength for it. His hat half crushed beside him, his breath slow and uneven, like a man who had forgotten why it mattered. Then something slipped from his coat pocket when they shoved him again. Something small, something that didn't belong in the dirt. A silver necklace catching the sun just long enough to be seen. No one else noticed, or if they did, they didn't care, but she did. She stepped forward, one quiet step that seemed louder than all the laughter, bent down, and picked it up with careful fingers, brushing off the dust like it held weight beyond metal. "Leave it," someone muttered, but she didn't. Ethan's eyes lifted then, just barely, catching the glint in her hand, and something flickered there, something buried deep beneath the whiskey and the years. She didn't rush, didn't flinch under the stairs, just walked straight toward him while boots shifted and voices dropped, the circle tightening, waiting for something to break. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the lines on his face, the kind carved by regret, not time, and held the necklace out, not giving it, not yet. "This meant something," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying further than it should have in that heavy air. The laughter thinned. Uncertain now, like wind losing its edge, Ethan stared at the necklace, at the way it caught the light, at the memory it pulled from somewhere he had tried to drown, and his hand twitched, but didn't reach. A man from the crowd scoffed. He don't remember nothing, but Ethan heard it, all of it, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't look away. The bottle near his boot rocked in the dust, half full, waiting, always waiting, and the town leaned in like it already knew the ending. But Ethan Cole didn't reach for the bottle. He looked at the necklace, then at the girl who refused to see him as anything less than a man, and the silence that followed stretched long and thin, like something about to change. The bottle tipped once more in the dust, slow, uncertain, like it was waiting for his hand to claim it. And for a long second, Ethan Cole did nothing, his eyes fixed on the silver in her palm, the faint scratches along its surface catching the light like scars that refused to fade. The town held its breath in a way it did not even realize. Boots stilled, voices lowered, the usual noise of midday fading into something quieter, something heavier. The girl did not move closer, did not force the moment. She simply stood there, her arms steady, her gaze unwavering, as if she had all the time in the world and none of the fear they expected from her. A man near the railing chuckled under his breath, trying to bring back the rhythm of mockery, but it fell flat, swallowed by the silence that had begun to spread. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, the taste of whiskey still lingering, but weaker now, like a memory losing its grip. "You should not be here," he said finally, his voice rough and used, but clear enough to carry. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one studies something worth understanding, not something already judged. "Neither should you," she answered, and there was no sharpness in it, only truth, plain and unadorned. A few heads turned at that, discomfort flickering across faces that preferred their stories simple, their people fixed in place. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders shifting as if something heavy had begun to loosen, not gone, but no longer crushing him the same way. He looked down at his own hands, at the dirt pressed into his skin, at the faint tremor that had once ruled him and now seemed to hesitate, uncertain of its place. The necklace glinted again, pulling his attention back, and with it came a memory not of failure, but of a promise made under a sky just as wide as this one, a promise he had buried beneath years of forgetting. The bottle rolled another inch, stopping against his boot, close enough to reach without effort, close enough to end the moment before it truly began. The crowd watched that bottle more than they watched him, waiting for the familiar ending, the one they could nod at and walk away from unchanged. But Ethan did not bend for it. Instead, slowly, deliberately, he pushed it aside with the side of his boot, the glass scraping softly against the dry ground, a small sound that carried farther than any shout. The girl's eyes did not widen, did not soften. They simply held him there, steady as ever, as if she had expected nothing less. "What is your name?" he asked, the question coming out quieter than the rest, but heavier. "Naeli," she said, and the name settled between them like something rooted, something that would not be moved by the shifting winds. "Of the town." Ethan nodded once, as if committing it to a place he had not used in a long time, and then, with a hand that still trembled just enough to remind him of the road behind, he reached toward the necklace, not to take it from her, but to touch it, to feel its weight again before deciding who he would be next. Around them, the town shifted, not loudly, not openly, but enough to show that something had changed, even if no one was ready to say it yet. The silver felt colder than he remembered, heavier too, like it had been carrying something in his absence. And when Ethan's fingers finally brushed against it, the contact sent a quiet tremor up his arm that had nothing to do with the bottle he had left behind. Naeli did not let go immediately, not out of resistance, but as if she was making sure he understood the weight before it became his again. Their hands lingered there for a second longer than expected, not touching fully, just close. Enough to pass something unseen between them. Then she released it, and the chain settled into his palm with a soft metallic whisper. The crowd shifted again, boots scraping, someone clearing a throat, the world trying to resume its usual shape but failing to quite get there. Ethan closed his fingers around the necklace slowly, deliberately, as if afraid that rushing the motion would break whatever fragile thing had begun. He turned it over once, the engraved edge catching sunlight, and for a brief moment his reflection flickered in the polished surface, not the man they saw, but someone quieter, steadier, someone he had not allowed himself to remember. "You kept it clean," he said, almost to himself, his voice lower now, steadier than before. Naeli watched him without blinking, her posture unchanged, grounded in a way that made the restless town seem smaller around her. "Some things should not be buried," she replied, and the words landed without force, but with certainty, like stones placed carefully to mark a path. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders easing just enough to be noticed by no one but her. Behind them, the saloon door creaked open and then closed again, the sound hollow. Familiar, calling to him the way it always had, but this time it felt distant, like a voice from another life. He glanced at it once, then back at the necklace, and then at Naeli, as if measuring which direction held more truth. The answer came not as a thought, but as a quiet refusal in his chest. He slipped the necklace into his hand instead of his pocket, choosing to feel its presence rather than hide it away again. "Why did you pick it up?" he asked after a moment, not looking at her directly this time, but not avoiding her either. Naeli's gaze softened just enough to be felt, not seen. "Because you did not," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only a statement that left no room to hide. A few men along the railing shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, unsure why the moment felt heavier than any confrontation they had witnessed before. Ethan nodded once, slow, accepting something without naming it, and then pushed himself to his feet, not with sudden strength, but with steady intention, dust falling from his coat as he rose inch by inch. The movement drew every eye, not because it was dramatic, but because it was different. He stood there, upright, the necklace resting in his palm, the bottle forgotten at his feet, and for the first time in a long while, he did not sway. Naeli stepped back half a pace, giving him space not as distance, but as respect, as if the man in front of her had just crossed a line no one else could see. The wind moved lightly through the street, carrying the scent of dry earth and sun-warmed wood, and in that quiet shift of air, something unseen settled into place, not loud, not certain, but real enough that even the town could not ignore it anymore. The town did not cheer and it did not jeer, it simply watched, and sometimes silence carries more weight than any shout ever could. Ethan stood there with dust on his boots and something steadier in his chest, the necklace resting in his hand like a quiet promise he had not yet earned, and for a moment no one moved, as if the street itself was deciding whether to accept what it was seeing. Then a chair scraped against wood near the saloon, sharp and deliberate, breaking the stillness like a stone dropped into calm water. "You think standing up makes you different?" A voice called out, not loud, but pointed enough to reach him. Ethan did not turn right away, his gaze still lowered to the silver in his palm, his thumb tracing the edge where time had worn it smooth. Nayeli remained a few steps behind him now, her presence no longer shielding him, only witnessing, which somehow felt heavier. He lifted his head slowly, not in challenge, not in defiance, just enough to acknowledge the voice without giving it more than it deserved. "No," he said, simple, steady. "It just means I am done sitting down." A few men shifted, unsure how to answer something that did not invite argument. The wind moved again, carrying the faint creak of wood and the distant call of a horse somewhere beyond the edge of town, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt sharper, clearer, as if the world had leaned closer. Ethan glanced once more at the saloon door, at the familiar shadow beneath it, the place that had held him for longer than he cared to measure, and then he stepped away from it, not fast, not dramatic, just one step, then another, each one placing a little more distance between who he had been and where he was standing now. The bottle lay behind him, untouched, its glass catching the sun in a dull reflection that no longer pulled at him the same way. Nayeli watched him move, her expression unchanged, but there was something quieter in her stance now, something like recognition rather than expectation. "Where will you go?" she asked, not as a challenge, not even as curiosity, but as if the question itself mattered more than the answer. Ethan paused at that, the question settling into him like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling outward. He looked past the buildings, past the worn fences and the narrow street, toward the open land stretching beyond, wide and indifferent and honest in a way the town had forgotten how to be. "Somewhere I can hear myself think," he said after a moment, his voice low, but certain. A faint murmur moved through the crowd, not agreement, not resistance, just the sound of people adjusting to something they had not planned for. Nayeli nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, as if that answer was enough. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to face her, the necklace still in his hand, and for a brief second it seemed like he might say more, like there were words waiting that had not yet found their way out. But instead, he simply closed his fingers around the silver and held it there, grounding himself in something real. The sun dipped just a fraction lower, casting longer shadows across the dirt, stretching the shapes of people and buildings alike into something unfamiliar, and in that shifting light, Ethan Cole took another step forward, not away from the town entirely, not yet, but far enough that the man he had been could no longer follow him as easily as before. The road out of town did not begin with a grand gesture. It began with dust shifting under a single step, and Ethan felt it in the way the ground answered him. Firm, real, not like the unsteady boards of the saloon floor he had known too well. Behind him, the town lingered in that strange quiet, not calling him back, not pushing him forward, just watching as if unsure whether to remember this moment or forget it by nightfall. The necklace rested in his closed hand, warm now from his skin, the edges no longer sharp against his fingers, but familiar, like something that had been waiting patiently for him to return. He did not look back at first, not because he was afraid, but because he knew exactly what he would see, the same faces, the same doubts, the same narrow street that had held him in place for longer than he cared to measure. Instead, he looked ahead, at the stretch of land beyond the last fence post, where the wind moved freely and nothing waited to judge him. Nayeli's footsteps were soft behind him, not following, not leaving, just present, and that presence settled differently than the crowd ever had, lighter, but somehow more certain. "You do not have to leave because of them," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the quiet between them. Ethan slowed, not stopping entirely, his boots pressing into the dry earth as he considered the words. "I am not leaving because of them," he answered after a moment, his voice steadier than it had been all day. "I am leaving because I stayed too long." The truth of it hung there, simple and unargued, and the wind carried it away without resistance. Nayeli stepped forward then, closing the small distance between them, not to stand beside him, but close enough that he could feel her presence without turning. And when you find what you are looking for, she asked, will you come back? The question did not rush him, did not demand anything. It simply existed, waiting. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to see her from the corner of his eye, the steady, calm in her stance, the way she seemed rooted even on shifting ground. He thought about the town, about the saloon door, about the bottle left behind, about the man they had all decided he was, and then about the man he had almost remembered holding that piece of silver. If there is something worth coming back for, he said quietly, and there was no bitterness in it, only a careful honesty. Naeli nodded once, as if that answer carried more promise than certainty ever could. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with things unspoken but understood, the kind of silence that did not press down, but held steady. Then Ethan opened his hand and looked at the necklace again. Really looked this time, at the small details, the worn places, the parts that had survived everything he had not. He lifted it slightly, letting the sunlight catch it once more, and for the first time, it did not feel like a reminder of what he had lost, but of what might still be found. He lowered his hand, closed his fingers around it again, and took another step forward, this one firmer than the last. Behind him, the town remained where it had always been, but it felt farther away now, not in distance, but in hold, and standing at the edge of it all. With the open land stretching ahead and a quiet witness at his back, Ethan Cole began to walk a road that no one else could choose for him. The land did not change all at once. It stretched out slowly, mile by mile, the town shrinking behind Ethan with each step until the sound of voices faded into nothing but wind brushing across open ground. His boots found a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, steady without stumbling, deliberate without hesitation, and that alone told him how long it had been since he had truly walked anywhere with purpose. The sun hung lower now, casting a softer light across the plains, turning the dust into something almost golden, and for the first time in years, Ethan noticed it, really noticed it, not as something passing over him, but as something he was moving through. The necklace rested against his palm again, and he turned it once more between his fingers, not searching for answers this time, just feeling the weight, the presence, the quiet reminder that something had survived even when he had not. Behind him, the town was no longer visible, only the faint outline of rooftops, swallowed by distance. And yet he could still feel it in a way, not as a pull, but as a memory that had lost its hold. He exhaled slowly, the air filling his lungs deeper than it had in a long time, as if the space around him allowed it. A sound reached him then, faint but steady, footsteps on dry ground, not hurried, not cautious, just consistent. He did not need to turn to know who it was. You walk like you are learning again, Naeli said, her voice calm, carrying easily across the quiet. Ethan allowed a small breath of something close to a smile, though it did not reach his face fully. Maybe I am, he replied, his tone honest in a way that surprised even him. She moved up beside him then, not matching his pace exactly, but close enough that their paths ran parallel, neither leading, neither following. For a while, they walked without speaking, the silence between them not empty, but full of small things, the sound of boots in dust, the distant call of a bird circling overhead, the faint creak of leather as he shifted his shoulders. After a time, Naeli glanced toward his hand, where the necklace still rested. You hold it like it might disappear, she said. Ethan looked down at it, then tightened his fingers slightly, not out of fear, but acknowledgement. I spent a long time pretending it already had, he answered. She nodded, as if that made sense in a way that did not need further explanation. The wind picked up briefly, brushing past them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, something fresh, something clean, and Ethan lifted his head slightly, taking it in. There is a creek about a mile ahead, Naeli said after a moment, her tone shifting just enough to suggest knowledge of the land beyond what the town had ever offered. Ethan considered that, then gave a small nod. Then that is where I will go, he said, not because it was the destination, but because it was the next step. They continued forward, the distance between them steady, the ground opening wider with each step, and as the last trace of the town faded completely from sight, Ethan realized something quiet but undeniable. For the first time in years, He was not walking away from something. He was walking toward it, even if he did not yet know what it was. The creek revealed itself not with sound, but with a shift in the air, cooler, softer, carrying the faint scent of water long before it came into view, and Ethan slowed without meaning to, his steps easing as if the land itself had asked him to pay attention. The ground beneath his boots changed from dry dust to packed earth, darker, firmer, marked by tracks that told quiet stories of things that passed through without leaving scars. Nayeli moved ahead slightly now, her pace guided by something deeper than sight, and when the water finally appeared, it did not rush or roar. It simply moved, steady and clear, reflecting the sky like it had nothing to prove. Ethan stopped at the edge, looking down at his reflection caught in the slow current, a face lined by more than years, eyes that had seen too much and chosen to forget even more. For a long moment, he did not move, just stood there, the necklace resting in his hand, the water offering a version of himself that felt both familiar and distant. Water does not remember what it carries, Nayeli said quietly behind him, her voice blending into the sound of the creek. But it always moves forward. Ethan let that settle, not as advice, but as something to be understood in its own time. He crouched slowly, the motion careful, deliberate, and dipped his free hand into the water, the cold cutting through the warmth of the day, sharp enough to wake something in him that had been asleep for far too long. He splashed a small amount onto his face, the dust and the last trace of whiskey scent fading under something cleaner, something real. When he straightened again, the air felt different against his skin, or maybe it was just him. He looked down at the necklace once more, then, with a hesitation that held meaning, he slipped it over his head, letting the silver rest against his chest where it belonged, not hidden, not forgotten. The weight settled there, light but certain, and for the first time, it did not feel like a burden. Nayeli watched without comment, her gaze steady, as if she understood that some choices did not need to be spoken aloud. A bird called from somewhere along the water's edge, sharp and brief, and the sound echoed across the open space, filling the silence in a way that felt right. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders loosening further, the tension he had carried for years beginning to unwind, not all at once, but enough to notice. "I thought I lost it," he said after a while, his voice quieter now, not rough, not strained, just honest. Nayeli stepped closer to the water, her reflection joining his in the current, two figures standing side by side without touching. "You did not lose it," she replied. "You stopped looking." Ethan considered that, his eyes tracing the way the water moved, always forward, never holding on, and for the first time, the thought did not feel like something slipping away, but something opening. He looked up from the creek then, toward the horizon beyond, where the land stretched wide and unbroken, and in that quiet space between who he had been and who he might become, something settled into place, not loudly, not completely, but enough that he knew this was only the beginning. The creek kept moving as if nothing had changed, as if men did not stand at its edge trying to remember who they were, and Ethan stayed there longer than he intended, not because he was unsure, but because for once, he was not rushing to escape himself. The silver against his chest felt different now, not heavy, not accusing, just present, like a quiet companion that did not need to speak to be understood. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the water, turning the surface into something deeper, something that did not reveal everything at once. Nayeli crouched near the bank, her fingers brushing lightly against the current, not disturbing it, only feeling its path, and for a while, neither of them spoke. The silence did not press. It held, steady and open. Then Ethan shifted his weight and stepped back from the edge, the decision simple, almost unnoticed, but real. "I cannot stay here forever," he said, not to her, not entirely, but to the space around him that had begun to feel like a pause between chapters. Nayeli rose slowly, the movement fluid, grounded, as if she had always known the moment would come. "No one does," she answered, and there was no urgency in it, only acceptance. Ethan looked at the land ahead again, the wide stretch of open ground that did not promise anything except truth, and for the first time, that felt enough. He adjusted the necklace slightly where it rested, the silver catching the last light of the day, And then he took a step forward, away from the creek this time, not because it had nothing more to offer, but because he had taken what he needed from it. The ground rose gently as they moved, the grass thinning into patches, the wind picking up just enough to carry the sound of their footsteps away. "Where does your path lead?" Ethan asked after a while, not out of curiosity. Alone, but because the question felt right to ask, Nayeli walked a few paces before answering, her gaze fixed on something beyond the horizon that he could not yet see. "It leads where it is needed," she said, and the words did not feel distant. They felt immediate, like they applied to more than just her. Ethan nodded slightly, not fully understanding, but not needing to yet. The sky shifted into deeper colors, the blue fading into something warmer, something quieter, and the land seemed to stretch even further under it. A faint trail appeared beneath their feet, barely visible, but worn enough to suggest others had walked it before, though not many. Ethan followed it without question, his steps falling into a rhythm that no longer felt forced. After some time, Nayeli slowed, then stopped, her posture changing just enough for him to notice. Ethan took one more step before pausing beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, barely visible in the fading light, stood the outline of a small structure, weathered, alone, standing against the open land like it had been waiting. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, focusing on it, something about it stirring a memory he could not quite reach. "That place," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Nayeli did not look at him, her gaze steady on the distant shape. "You know it," she said, not asking. Ethan did not answer right away, but the way his hand moved unconsciously to the necklace said enough. The wind carried across the distance, brushing past them, and in that moment, the land did not feel empty anymore. It felt like it was leading him somewhere he had left unfinished, and without another word, Ethan Cole took a step toward that distant structure, not knowing what waited there, but knowing it was something he could no longer walk past. The structure grew clearer with each step, no longer just a shape against the horizon, but something real, something that had once held purpose and now stood quiet, weathered by time and distance. Ethan slowed without meaning to, his eyes fixed on the familiar lines of the place, the slanted roof, the broken fence stretching a few yards to one side, the door hanging slightly off-center as if it had been left that way on purpose. The air shifted again, carrying a faint scent. That was not just dust or grass, something older, something tied to memory rather than land. Nayeli stopped a few steps behind him this time, not following him forward, as if she understood that whatever waited there belonged to him alone. Ethan took another step, then another, each one heavier than the last, not with doubt, but with recognition settling in piece by piece. "I built this," he said quietly, the words almost lost to the wind, but steady enough to be true. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something he had locked away and was now being returned without asking. The small cabin stood no more than 30 yards ahead, its wood faded by sun and years, but still standing, still holding its shape against the open land. Ethan's hand moved to the necklace again, his fingers pressing lightly against it, as if grounding himself in the present while the past rose up around him. He could see it now, not just as it was, but as it had been, the door. Straight, the fence whole, the space alive with purpose rather than silence. "Why did you leave it?" Nayeli's voice came softly from behind, not pressing, just present. Ethan did not turn, his gaze fixed on the cabin as he searched for the answer that had been waiting longer than he had admitted. "Because I thought there was nothing left worth staying for," he said after a moment, the words carrying no weight of excuse, only truth. The wind moved through the broken fence, producing a low creak. That sounded almost like a response, or maybe just the land reminding him that time had passed whether he noticed or not. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance until he stood just a few feet from the door, the wood worn but solid beneath his eyes. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering for a second before touching it, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers, the proof that this place had once been real, not just a memory. He did not open it yet, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that crossing that threshold meant facing something he had left unfinished. Behind him, Nayeli remained still, her presence steady but distant now, allowing the moment to belong entirely to him. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and for the first time since he had stepped away from the town, he felt the weight of where he had come from not as something pulling him back, but as something asking to be understood. The sky above had deepened into a quiet dusk, the last light stretching across the land and settling against the cabin like it had been waiting for him to return. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the wood, and in that stillness, between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, he stood at the edge of a door he knew he could not leave closed any longer. The door did not resist him. It only waited, and when Ethan finally pushed it open, it moved with a slow creak that carried more memory than sound, the kind that settles deep in the chest before the mind can name it. The air inside was still, untouched, holding the faint scent of old wood and something long faded, like a place that had been paused rather than abandoned. He stepped across the threshold carefully, not out of caution, but out of respect, as if the space remembered him even if he had tried to forget it. The light from outside stretched across the floor in a narrow band, illuminating dust that hung quietly in the air, unmoving until disturbed by his presence. Ethan stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting the past come back in its own time. The room was small, no more than a few paces across, but it carried more weight than the entire town he had left behind. A table stood near the far wall, one leg slightly uneven, a chair tucked beneath it as if someone had intended to return at any moment. A folded blanket rested on a narrow bed in the corner, untouched, preserved by absence rather than care. Ethan took a step forward, then another, his boots quieter here, the ground solid beneath him. His gaze moved slowly, taking in each detail, not rushing, not avoiding, just seeing. The necklace against his chest felt warmer now, resting over his heartbeat, and he reached up briefly, pressing it there as if to steady himself. "You left everything as it was," Naeli said from the doorway, her voice low, not crossing into the room, only touching its edge. Ethan did not turn, his eyes fixed on the table, where something small caught the last of the light. He moved toward it, each step deliberate, until he stood just inches away. There, resting near the center, lay a simple object, worn but carefully placed, not hidden, not forgotten, just waiting. His hand hovered above it for a moment, the air between his fingers and the surface carrying more hesitation than fear. "I thought if I walked away," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, "it would stop mattering." The words settled into the room, not echoing, just existing. He lowered his hand, touching the object gently, as if confirming it was real, as if confirming that what he had left behind had not disappeared simply because he had turned away. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things unspoken, of moments paused rather than ended. Outside, the wind moved across the open land, brushing against the cabin walls, a reminder that time had not stood still, even if this place had tried to hold on to it. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to feel, to allow the weight of it all to settle without resistance. When he opened them again, there was no rush, no sudden change, just a quiet acceptance that this place, this moment, was part of him whether he stayed or left. He straightened slightly, his shoulders no longer carrying the same bend, and for the first time since stepping inside, he looked around not as someone returning to what was lost, but as someone deciding what could still remain. The door behind him stayed open, the last light of day stretching into the room, touching everything without judgment, and in that soft, fading glow, Ethan Cole stood in a place he had once abandoned, no longer running from it, but not yet certain what it would ask of him next. The object did not move when he touched it, but something inside him did, subtle at first, like a shift in balance he had not noticed he was missing. It was a small wooden carving, worn smooth at the edges, shaped by careful hands rather than time alone, and Ethan's fingers traced its surface slowly, recognizing the marks not just with sight, but with memory. He had made this, years ago, in a moment when the world had felt steady enough to build something meant to last. The room seemed to draw closer around him, not closing in, but focusing, as if everything that remained here was waiting for him to understand it properly this time. Behind him, Naeli did not step inside. Her presence held at the threshold like a boundary she chose not to cross. allowing the silence to belong entirely to him. "You did not leave because there was nothing," she said quietly, her voice carrying into the room without breaking it. "You left because you believed it was gone." Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand still resting on the carving, his gaze fixed on it as if it might answer something he had never asked out loud. "I stopped believing it could stay," he replied, the words steady, not defensive, not regretful, just clear. The wind brushed against the open doorway again, lifting a faint swirl of dust that caught the last light and settled just as quickly, like a reminder that nothing here had been erased, only left waiting. Ethan picked up the carving then, lifting it carefully, feeling its weight in his palm, light but certain, like the necklace against his chest, like the steps he had taken to get here. He turned it once, examining it not for flaws, but for truth, for what it still held after everything he had tried to forget. "You built this place," Naeli said, not as a question, but as something already known. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes still on the carving. "I built it because I thought it could hold something worth keeping." The words settled into the room, and for the first time, they did not feel like something lost, but something unfinished. Ethan lowered the carving back onto the table, not in the same place it had been, but close enough to acknowledge it, to place it as it was now, not as it had been left. He straightened slowly, his shoulders no longer carrying the same weight, his posture no longer bent by something unseen. He turned then, finally, facing the doorway, facing Naeli, the open land behind her stretching into the fading light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the distance between them holding something quiet but understood. "It is still standing," she said, her eyes meeting his, steady, certain. Ethan glanced around the room once more, at the table, the bed, the door still open, to the outside, and then back at her. "So am I," he answered, not with pride, not with defiance, but with a calm that had not been there before. The last light of the day slipped further across the floor, stretching toward the back wall, and in that slow movement of shadow and glow, the space no longer felt like something abandoned, but something returned to. Ethan stepped toward the doorway, not leaving, not yet, but no longer held inside, his hand brushing briefly against the frame as he passed, grounding himself in the present. Outside, the air felt cooler, clearer, the open land waiting without demand. And as he stood there, between the place he had left and the path still ahead, Ethan Cole understood something quiet and certain. He had not come back to remember what was lost. He had come back to decide what would remain. The air outside the cabin settled into that quiet hour where the day lets go without making a sound, and Ethan stood just beyond the doorway, not inside, not fully out, the kind of place a man finds himself when he has finally stopped running but has not yet chosen where to stand. The land stretched wide in front of him, unchanged, honest, carrying no memory of who he had been, only space for who he might become. Behind him, the cabin held its silence, no longer heavy, no longer waiting, just present, like something that had done its part and would not ask for more. Naeli remained a few steps away, her posture calm, her eyes on him, not pushing, not guiding, only witnessing the choice he had come all this way to face. Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand resting briefly over the necklace against his chest, feeling its steady weight, not as a reminder of the past, but as something anchored in the present. "I thought coming back would give me answers," he said quietly, his voice carrying into the open space without resistance. Naeli tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "And did it?" Ethan considered that, not searching for something complicated, just listening to what remained after everything else had settled. "No," he said after a moment. "It gave me something better." The wind moved lightly across the land, brushing past them, carrying the faint sound of grass shifting in the distance, and in that simple motion, the world seemed to agree without needing to say it. Naeli nodded once, as if that answer was enough, as if it had always been enough. Ethan stepped forward then, not toward the cabin, not back toward the town, but into the open land ahead, the direction that had no path laid out, only possibility. His steps were steady now, not forced, not uncertain, just chosen. After a few paces, he stopped and turned slightly, not all the way, just enough to look back at the cabin one last time. It stood there in the fading light, unchanged, but no longer holding him the same way. "I am not leaving it behind," he said, almost to himself, but clear enough to be heard. "I am just not living in it anymore." Nayeli's expression softened just slightly, not with emotion, but with understanding. "Then it will always be yours," she replied, her voice quiet, certain. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without needing to hold on to it. The sky above shifted into deeper shades, the first hint of evening settling across the land, and the horizon stretched further than it had before, or maybe he was just seeing it differently now. He turned forward again, the necklace resting steady against him, the weight no longer something he carried, but something that moved with him. The ground beneath his boots felt firm, real, each step marking a path that did not need to be seen to exist. Behind him, the cabin remained, not as a place of regret, but as a place that had been faced and understood. Beside him, Nayeli began to walk again, not leading, not following, simply there, her presence steady as the land itself. And as they moved forward into the quiet stretch of open space, the past no longer followed Ethan Cole like a shadow. It stood where it belonged, behind him, still, silent, and finally at peace. Morning did not arrive with noise. It arrived with light, soft and steady, stretching across the land as if nothing needed to be announced. And Ethan Cole felt it before he fully opened his eyes, the warmth touching his face, the ground beneath him firm and real. Not the uneven boards of a saloon, not the emptiness of a place left behind, but something honest. He sat up slowly, the memory of the day before settling into him without resistance, not heavy, not sharp, just present, like a story that had finally been told all the way through. The necklace rested against his chest, warm now, no longer something he reached for, but something that stayed with him without effort. Beside him, the land stretched quiet and open, the kind of quiet that did not demand anything, only offered space. Nayeli stood a short distance away, facing the horizon, her silhouette still against the early light, as if she had been there long before the sun rose. Ethan watched her for a moment, not searching for meaning, not trying to understand, just seeing, and that alone felt different. He stood, brushing the dust from his coat, his movements steady, grounded, the kind that came from knowing where your feet were, even if you did not yet know where they would take you. "Does it feel different?" Nayeli asked without turning, her voice carrying easily through the morning air. Ethan looked out across the land, the wide stretch of earth and sky meeting somewhere far beyond where he could see, and he let the question settle before answering. "It feels quiet," he said, then after a moment, "but not empty." Nayeli nodded slightly, as if that was the only answer that mattered. The wind moved gently, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, the same land, the same air, but something in it had shifted, or maybe something in him had. Ethan took a step forward, then another, not out of urgency, not out of escape, but because standing still was no longer the only option he knew. The path ahead was not marked, not clear, but it did not need to be. Each step created it in its own way. After a few paces, he stopped and glanced back, not at the town, not at the saloon, but toward the distant shape of the cabin, barely visible now in the morning light. It stood there, unchanged, quiet, no longer calling him back, no longer holding anything over him. He gave a small nod, not as farewell, not as regret, but as acknowledgement. Then he turned forward again. Nayeli stepped into motion beside him, her pace matching his without effort, her presence steady, neither leading nor following, simply there. They walked in silence, the kind that did not need to be filled, the kind that allowed a man to hear himself clearly for the first time. The sun rose higher, the light spreading across the land, revealing everything without judgment, without expectation. Ethan adjusted the necklace slightly where it rested, not out of habit, but out of awareness, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself a small breath that felt almost like relief. Not because everything was solved, not because the past was erased, but because he was no longer standing still inside it. The land stretched on, wide and patient, and somewhere within that quiet expanse, a man who had once been forgotten walked forward, not to prove anything, not to be seen, but simply to be. And out here, where the wind carried no voices and the dust held no memory, that was enough.